I'm George Galloway, and I'm in front of the United States Embassy in London. As the first Cuban flag is hoisted in Washington in more than half a century, and as the first American flag is hoisted in Havana, join me on كلمة on Al Mayadeen television, coming to you from London to discuss the remarkable change in US-Cuban relations. What does it mean for America, for Cuba, for Latin America and the world? Join me for كلمة where every word is free. George Galloway on Al Mayadeen television. Coming to you from London. I'm George Galloway, presenting كلمة where every word is free. Welcome to كلمة with me, George Galloway, on Al Mayadeen television, coming to you from London, where I'm joined by a group of experts and gifted amateurs, just like me. We're talking about Cuba and the United States, and what the new peace, which appears to have broken out between them, means for Cuba, for the United States, for Latin America, and more widely for the world. For more than half a century, well over half a century, the United States maintained a position of bitter enmity towards the Cuban Revolution, the Cuban leadership, and a vindictive embargo which it imposed upon the people of Cuba, which made them suffer quite a bit over that more than half century. However, necessity being the mother of invention, the Cubans rose to the challenge of the United States embargo and made their country famous and loved all around the world. A good example of the law of unintended consequences. Cuba has emerged as a world leader in many important respects, particularly in medicine and biotechnology, exactly as a result of the United States quarantine, which is, of course, an act of war that they have maintained for more than 50 years against Cuba. But they didn't eschew actual wars. They invaded and sought to occupy Cuba at the Bay of Pigs in the early 1960s. They subverted Cuba in all manner of ways, not stopping short of terrorism, the facilitating of the blowing up of civilian airliners, just one dreadful, dastardly example. But they paid for all manner of terrorism to be visited on the people of Cuba on the island and also Cuban targets elsewhere. And then they imprisoned Cuban intelligence officers for the crime of trying to catch some of the terrorists that were operating out of Florida in the United States. The United States tried more times than I can count, but it's certainly in the hundreds. They tried to assassinate the Cuban leader Fidel Castro in all kind of weird and wonderful ways, including exploding cigars, poisoned rubber wetsuits, and many other tactics. They have maintained this position of hatred and enmity against Cuba, not because Cuba ever did anything against them, but because Cuba provided the threat of a good example, an example of what could be, an example of what the Caribbean, of what Latin America, of what we call the third world could be if it took the path of independent development rather than subjugation to neoliberal economics and neoconservative foreign policies. Cuba played a vital role in the defeat of apartheid South Africa. That's why Nelson Mandela, upon his release, went first to Cuba to thank the Cuban people and their leaders for the vital contribution which they had made. Cuba's internationalism is legend, and one of the reasons why people love it all over the world. The same cannot be said for the United States, except in this regard. President Barack Obama seems to be saving the best for last. On the Iran nuclear talks and on the Cuban front, he appears to be determined to leave some kind of legacy, at least, so that we will remember the 8 years of his presidency. And I think that we should take off our hats to him, for in the teeth of tremendous domestic opposition based around Florida, but also other important electoral swing states where he has faced down the worst of Cuban emigre right-wing reactionary politics and said that enough is enough. The war with Cuba has gone on for long enough, and it's time to turn the page, open a new chapter in Cuban-US relations. Cuba, which prior to the revolution had been little more than a casino, a bordello, a playground for the US-based mafia and other rich Americans, has been transformed in the period since. One of the questions we'll be asking tonight is what will happen to Cuba once the embargo is over and once the United States begins to be more heavily engaged with Cuba, something that is of concern to those of us who love the achievements of the Cuban Revolution. My distinguished experts and the gifted amateurs will speak next after this. You're watching Kalima Horra on Al Mayadeen with me, George Galloway, coming to you from London, but discussing Cuba, the United States, what the new peace which seems to be breaking out between the two actually means for both of them, for the region, and for the world. Bernard Reagan is one of the leaders of the Cuba Solidarity Campaign, one of the very best of such campaigns operating out of London. Bernard, what do you say?
George, well, first of all, congratulations on the programme. I'd say a couple of things. Firstly, in terms of the United States, what we're seeing is a move towards a re-establishment of diplomatic relations, not an ending of the blockade. I think it's very important to say that because that has to be ratified by Congress. And as you know, Congress has been very hostile both to his positions on Cuba and indeed his attitudes on Iran. So I think it's still an open question how far these changes will go. The second thing is in terms of what will happen should positive relations be established. I think one of our centres of our campaign has been for the right of Cuba to determine its own future. So I think it will be very much a debate that is going on already in Cuba that will develop in terms of how they respond to that situation. But currently, I think it would be premature to say we've seen peace breaking out. Indeed, if you also look at the Republican candidates for the presidential election, you find a great deal of hostility still there. People like Marco Rubio, people like others, Jeb Bush.
What's Jeb Bush's position?
Exactly, it's exactly the same. He says that Obama is actually giving in to shaking hands with the devil and that this is not something that he would wish to see were he to be president. So I think we have to be extremely cautious about how far these changes will bring about a real change in relationships between the United States and Cuba.
That caveat made, and it's an important one. What's the response inside Cuba? If there's opposition in the US to the deal, is there any opposition within the political class in Cuba to it? What kind of anxieties are there in Cuba about what the implications of an eventual end of the embargo might be?
Well, Josefina Vidal, who's leading the Cuban side in the discussions with the United States of America, has made very clear that there are two real issues which they want to see addressed in order to reach a successful outcome. The first, as I mentioned already, is a blockade, and the second, which is a real important indicator of United States change of attitude, is their withdrawal from Guantanamo and the return of Guantanamo to Cuba as a sovereign part of Cuba itself. And those
just explain to our viewers how Guantanamo comes to be a torture camp owned by the United States.
Yes, it's a long story. It goes back literally to the end of Spanish rule in Cuba in the 1890s, when the United States invaded in order, as they had done for actually many, many decades, wanted to take Cuba into the United States orbit and become part of the United States, in fact. And the intention when they invaded Cuba was, as I've said, to impose a proconsul, somebody who would rule on behalf of the United States. And as part of that agreement, they laid down all kind of restrictions on what Cuba could do. It couldn't have an independent foreign policy. It couldn't develop its own economy. It had to have the approval of Washington and Wall Street, of course. And what they did was they said in the course of that, we want bases in Cuba, and those bases will only be removed by mutual consent. There were 4 originally. Now it's down to the one of Guantanamo, and that remains. And of course, the United States has to agree. Cuba can't withdraw its permission and then see the troops returning back to the United States. It has to be by mutual agreement. That's the stumbling block.
So these 2 demands, principal demands, the issue of the embargo, Guantanamo, that being so, what about I well remember visiting Vietnam maybe 10 years after the victory there, and one of the things that the Vietnamese leaders had to concede was that when you open the door and open the windows, the flies come in. You get fresh air, you get sunlight, but you also get flies. To what extent is Cuba anxious that its now virtually unique social and political and economic system will be undermined by the new period that may lie ahead?
Well, I think first thing to say is that as far as Cuba is concerned, they draw a very sharp distinction between the government of the United States of America and the presidents and the administrations that have been operating this blockade and the people of the United States of America. And there is no animosity towards the people, and I think that's been something which has been well understood. And if you go to Cuba, not only do people have family in the United States of America, but they have a very positive sense of relationship with the American people. So on that side, on a very kind of personal, social level, tourism and so on, that's not going to be problematic. But in terms of how they will respond to the challenges of the United States, I think Cuba is very clear that any foreign investment inside Cuba from whatever source will only be done in conjunction with the Cuban government, and therefore I think they will be able to keep control over that. They won't have, for example, people being employed on terms or conditions that are less favorable than other people employed in Cuba. They won't allow health and safety to be ignored. They won't allow the social gains that you mentioned at the very beginning, like health and education, to be in any way diluted. So I think they will keep a very strong control over that overall framework. But within that, as you've suggested, there will be changes, and there are already changes taking place, some of which are to do with the independent economy, the private enterprise, if you like, self-employment, where what they are doing is they're bringing that within a legalized structure, ensuring that they can tax people earning money in individual employment, in self-employment, so that they can contribute to society and ensure that the gains that have been made in those areas I've spoken about will be retained.
Thank you, Bernard. Who would like to make the next contribution on this? Yes, my friend.
Yeah, I guess I'd like to just echo what Bernard was saying about the importance of seeing Guantanamo Bay as an issue, not only for the very important issue of a prison where people are detained without charge or trial, and there's still over 100 people there, but perhaps the wider question of why the United States is there in the first place. And I think reading the press in the United Kingdom, from the right-wing corporate press, the BBC, and also the liberal press, what amazes me is that the issue of the fundamental illegitimacy of the United States illegally occupying Cuban land almost never comes up. And I'm a filmmaker and a journalist, and I've been living in Cuba for the last 3 years. And what strikes me is that I have many Cuban friends who like the government, many who hope that it collapses tomorrow, many right-wingers. But what brings almost all of them together, and it's interesting to see as an outsider, is a real visceral feeling that the United States ought not to be in Guantanamo. And if you go to Guantanamo City, which is about 20 miles from the naval base itself, people say that they've no right to be there, that they occupy the finest part of the province. It's no coincidence, for example, that Guantanamo is the poorest of all Cuban provinces because it hasn't been able to develop. It's an incredible place that could be used for port facilities, trading with the rest of the world. All of this economic development has been impeded by the US's presence at Guantanamo, and I think that ought to be highlighted more in the political debate in the UK, for example.
And the name of Guantanamo, which ought to be and is a beautiful name, has become a kind of curse around the world because of the use to which, in the last more than decade now particularly, to which the United States has put it. People are tortured there. They are killed. They've died there. They're taken in shackles and drugged and kidnapped from around the world and taken there. This must be very hard for the Guantanamera to accept.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, speaking to historians in Guantanamo and people you bump into in parks and on the street, there's a sentiment that runs through society, that runs through lots of people I spoke to in Guantanamo, which is that, yeah, the name of the city and the province has been sullied. They don't want to be associated with torture and rendition, waterboarding, yet they've become so. So it's difficult to overstate the psychological scar, if you want to put it that way, that has been left because of that.
Very interesting. Anyone else? Yes, gentlemen.
First of all, it is very good news that the America and Cuba are started the friendly relationship. But the thing is that why they have been occupying Guantanamo for 50 years? I mean, they are like big brothers to everybody in the world. And not only in Guantanamo Bay, but also in the Iraq, in the Camp Liberty. This is also a prison in disguise, just like over there. And people are...
a wonderful name for a torture camp.
Exactly, in disguise.
Liberty.
It's exactly like the Camp Ashraf, where people are tortured, murdered all the time. You know. So why America is occupying foreign lands for this purpose, not in America? If they want to keep prisoners, they should keep in America.
They don't keep them in America because they would have to comply with U.S. law. And therefore, they have worked out this wheeze of kidnapping them and taking them to foreign prisons where they can torture as they wish. The United States does actually write a check every year for the rent on Guantanamo Bay, but the Cuban government, of course, returns the check uncashed because the illegitimacy of their occupation of Guantanamo is something upon which they insist. But the real answer to your question is the concept of American exceptionalism, that someone, God, gave them the right to roam around the world, invading and occupying other people's countries and seeking to bend their countries to their own will and definitely for their own interest.
Exactly. But I'm not so much worried about the money which they give. I'm thinking about the torture which is going on,
Indeed.
Carried out, especially to the Muslims.
Indeed.
And in Camp Liberty and in Guantanamo, everywhere they're destroying, they are against Islam. I don't know why they fear so much against Islam. Islam is a peaceful religion. So why the America is so much against them? And everywhere in Iraq and Libya and Afghanistan, they are...
Well, I wouldn't like you to think that the Muslims were alone in having the enmity of the United States. Bernard and I are old enough to remember when they were murdering Vietnamese and Cambodian people in their millions, who were not Muslim, of course, but they were standing up to the United States. The United States murders people who stand up to them, whether they're Muslims or not. As it happens, most of the people being murdered today are Muslims. But in my lifetime, that has not always been the case. Will be more of this after the break. You're watching كلمة with me, George Galloway, for Al Mayadeen Television, coming from London, discussing Cuba, the United States, and what the new period that may lie ahead would mean for both, and for the region, and for the world. But also raising the possibility that there will be no new era, that in fact, President Obama's opening to Cuba will soon be closed, either by the next president or by a right-wing controlled Congress. And either way, the implications are profound. Let's hear from our gifted audience. Yes, sir, please.
Hi, George. My name's Akib. As a follow-up from what Bernard said, if Cuba's moving towards normalization with the United States in terms of diplomatic ties and full political ties, maybe even, or economic ties, do you think that's a wrong move on the part of Cuba? Because it's just opening the doors of destruction. The United States, ambitions and plans for Cuba have never been hidden. As he stated, they've been trying to invade and occupy and make it a part of the United States for a long time. And, it's just opening the doors of destruction for them. Even if they have all these caveats that, Guantanamo Bay has to go and, you can't treat us like this and we have to have these problems. No matter what kind of deal or settlement they reach with the United States, it will never be enough for the United States because they will always continually demand more. And I'm speaking particularly in the context of countries like Libya and Syria, who actually did deals with the United States in the past, and they've turned out to be not enough. And now look at this situation; they're completely being destroyed now.
Well, it's a very good question that you raise. My answer would be, Bernard can respond on behalf of the campaign, I'm sure, that it's not a bad thing that the deal is being done or being negotiated. It's not yet done. It's an unnatural situation that a country 90 miles away is in a state of siege and semi-war. Quarantine being an act of war is actually at war, and for 2 generations now. And it's an unnatural thing that should be brought to an end. Of course, bringing it to an end poses many challenges. I gave the example of Vietnam earlier. Vietnam today bears little relation to the Vietnam that many of those who fought and died to liberate would have wanted. That's a product of the global social and political and economic realities that we now live in. But at least the Vietnamese people are free. They are free of foreign occupation. They're not free of foreign exploitation, and Cuba will have to be careful to avoid becoming prey to foreign exploitation. And the United States are experts in exploiting the resources of other people. But the big difference, I hope it's not offensive to our viewers for me to say, is that the leadership in Cuba is of a very different kind, and for that matter, quality, than the leadership in Libya and Syria. You can fool some people some of the time, but I doubt if the Cuban leadership has ever been fooled or will ever be fooled. Of course, as the young gentleman said, there are people in Cuba, we don't know, can't know how many, who want to sweep away the political leadership in Cuba, who want to unravel. They would probably say they would like to keep this and that, but they want to unravel effectively the political and economic system. The United States will find these people if it hasn't found them already. The United States will fund these people if they're not funding them already, because they definitely want to bring about a return to the Cuba that existed before the revolution, when any gangster could come and open a casino. You've seen it in the Godfather, famously, Godfather Part 2, where the corrupt dictator sat around the table with the American mafia chiefs and the chiefs of the big corporations and carved out like a cake the interests and the wealth of the Cuban people. But I am persuaded that enough people in Cuba have no intention of going back, and that they have a leadership wise and determined enough to resist at least some of the flies that will come in through the open windows.
Isn't the problem that there aren't enough people in the United States that feel that way? That's the real problem, because obviously the Cubans, either by choice or even without choice, they can't really say, but they do feel that way about the way their society is run, the way their politics is done, and the way their country is being run all these years. But the real problem is the people in the United States. Their attitude towards Cuba, and especially the people in power in the United States, in Congress, as you mentioned before, and the CIA, the Pentagon, who seem to have a mind of their own. Their attitudes towards countries like Cuba is just, it's just opposite, the complete opposite of what Obama's trying to achieve. Maybe his heart is in the right place, but it's not going to be able to achieve the goals that they want to achieve, and they're going to, interfere. They're going to fund people who are against the regime or who are against the government in Cuba. They're going to fund people who are against that sort of philosophy and ideology, and it's only just opening the doors for destruction. It's gonna, it's not going to take much for infighting and civil war to erupt in a country like that. If we've seen it before with the Bay of Pigs and stuff like that. They don't care about how many people died. They just want their goals. They just want to achieve those goals, and that's my problem with this sort of diplomatic relations resuming.
Well, that would be an extreme end of U.S. intervention, turning Cuba into Syria. I don't myself expect that to happen, not least because the Cuban Communist Party is millions strong, and they've all got weapons. So I don't expect that. But what I do expect is an incremental ratcheting up of the challenges. It's going to be a big struggle, a big challenge for the Cuban leadership. But then the last 55 years have also been different kind of struggle and challenges. Bernard, what do you say to that?
I'd agree with the points that you've made, George. The other thing I'd say is this, that the scenario in which Cuba is confronted by the United States policy is very different now than it was 20 years ago in particular. And that is because we've seen significant changes in Latin America. We now see a country like Venezuela with the late President Hugo Chavez. We see a country like Bolivia with Evo Morales. We see changes taking place on the continent that I think mean that Cuba has allies and friends. Indeed, one of the reasons why there's a change in American policy was given away by President Obama when he said the problem for the United States is it is isolated. In other words, in the rest of Latin America, before they could begin discussions on anything to do with economics or trade or politics or whatever with any of the countries, the first question they asked is, when are you going to end your illegal treatment of Cuba? When are you going to end the blockade? So I think that the scenario that Cuba faces is in a different kind of environment. The other thing is this, that a big factor, I think, which is concerning the United States of America, is that between 2000 and 2009, for example, Chinese trade with Latin America increased by 1,200%. Now that's absolutely phenomenal. And what that means is that the Latin Americans have other places in the world to look at. They have friends in Brazil, they have friends in India, they have friends in South Africa, and so on and so forth. And I think it means that the United States isn't able to act with impunity in terms of the way it treats Cuba. So I think the situation is slightly different. I agree with you when you say we would like to see a regime change in the United States of America. I think the people of Palestine, the people of Iraq, the people of Afghanistan, and many parts of the world would welcome that. But it was the case that there was a change in public opinion towards Cuba. One would wish to see that reflected in the kind of governments they elected as well.
Of course, all of that is absolutely true, though it's not the whole picture, because in the places that you mention, particularly in Venezuela, this is also being contested by the United States, and in a very aggressive way. The attempts to destabilize and overthrow even Hugo Chavez, but more particularly now President Maduro and the Venezuelan revolution are ongoing and severe, and we cannot guarantee that they will not in the end be successful. So the current picture in Latin America is not necessarily fixed forever. Let's take some more. Yes, gentleman at the back.
Yeah, Richard Sudan, I'm a journalist. Yeah, I'm interested to know what you think, George, and perhaps other contributors here. How is the Cuban Revolution going to develop, be impacted, and how will it continue beyond the current leadership? It's been the Castro brothers for a while. What are the implications in the future for potential new leadership?
Well, of course, Raúl Castro, the leader now, is old, and a new generation of leaders is no doubt preparing to step forward and pick up the baton, pick up the rifle of the Cuban Revolution. That's natural and inevitable. Some changes in Cuba have already been made, as Bernard has explained. Not so long ago, virtually no private enterprise and private trade was permitted. Now, then it began to proliferate in the black economy, and now some of it, much of it, has been legalized. The dollar is more or less openly used now, whereas before there were great efforts made to avoid the dollarization of the economy. Private property was not permitted before, but is now to some extent accepted. So these are ideological challenges which are already underway. Yes, please come back.
Do you think, and I mean, I agree that it's a good thing that the relations are somewhat thawing, economically, the ties. Do you sense that imperial interests in the US may well sense a kind of window of opportunity with the eventual inevitable, the Castro brothers and the current leadership finishing? Do you think some interests sense a window of opportunity, and perhaps?
I'm sure. Of course, the fact that Fidel Castro was an enormously powerful leader didn't stop them trying before, but a new leadership does open perhaps new possibilities. Just as in Venezuela, they have redoubled their efforts to destabilize Venezuela under the new leadership. They've doubled their bets, if you like, under the new leadership. So far they haven't succeeded. But that's not stopped them from trying. There are a number of pressures on the Cuban Revolution. The first is, in cash terms, Cubans are poor. The leader in Cuba earns $30 a month. I'm not making that up, because everybody in the public sector, at least it was $30 a month the last time I was there. Bernard will tell me if it's gone up, but if it has gone up, it won't have gone up by much. I was living in an apartment block, and in the floor above me was living the son of Che Guevara, who is a functionary in the Foreign Affairs Ministry, and his salary is $30 a month. Were he to leave Cuba and become a kind of international playboy, God forbid, he'd be a very rich man and very much in demand, but he would never do so because he's committed to the ideals of his father and his mother, but the Cuban Revolution more generally. So Cubans are poor. Some are ready to be poor in order to be equal and in order to have the other things that Cuba has, which make them extremely rich by comparison with other neighbors, even near neighbors. Every Cuban child has a free kindergarten, a free primary school, a free secondary school, a free university, and many millions have benefited from that. That's not true in much of the rest of the poor countries of the world. Cuban medicine is so good that the life expectancy of someone in Havana is much higher, longer, than it is in Washington, D.C. Indeed, it's comparable to Scandinavia. Child mortality, the number of children dying in the first year of life, is much lower than it is in Washington, D.C. Cuba's cultural, sporting, and other achievements are all riches. They're not dollars, but they're riches. And many Cubans realize that there isn't much point in having more dollars in your pocket if you've got to start paying for your education, if you've got to start paying for your health care, if you've got to become a part of an economy, international economy, which has beggared most people in the world, and especially in the poor countries. There's a billboard I was always particularly proud of, I don't know if it's still there, in Havana, which said, and I quote, 110 million children under the age of 10 go to work every day instead of school. Not one of them is in Cuba. I'll be right back. You're watching كلمة with me, George Galloway, on Al Mayadeen Television, coming to you from London, discussing Cuba. Let's hear what the next contributor would like to say. Yes, sir, please.
We remember in 1960 when the Cuban crisis came, Khrushchev and Kennedy.
I'm younger than I look, so I was only 6.
That's right. So the NATO had many missiles dotted around close to Russia. When Russia wanted one close to the American shore, and it was a big hoo-ha, nearly Third World War could have erupted, and that caused the broken down of relationship. So what it took so long to maintain, which is happening last week, to maintain relationship when the America was mighty power, and where the Cuba compared to America, which is a very feeble. But Cuban people have shown the resilience, come up, as you said, in medicine and education, and they help around the world during disaster time. I remember in Pakistan they came in and people were very happy during the earthquake in Kashmir. We were very grateful to them. The thing arises, what caused it? To my knowledge, I think the economy, which is like Chinese knocking at the door of South America, and BRICS, probably the congressmen there, they realize we have to do something about it because America loved their dollars and they want to maintain their standard of living. And probably it could be a legacy of Obama, but it still have to go through the Republican heavy Congress to pass it, to ratify it, and that remains to be seen. Thank you.
That's true. The Cuban Missile Crisis in 1963, which despite only being 9 years old, I actually do remember and have written about, was not, of course, the cause of the problems between Cuba and the United States. It was a response to the problems between Cuba and the United States. The United States had just invaded Cuba before the missiles were planned for there, and indeed had been trying to overthrow the Cuban Revolution from more or less the first day. And so the Cuban people are not at all feeble in a strategic sense, in terms of strategic warfare and so on, nuclear. Yes, undoubtedly they are the weaker partner. But one of the reasons why the United States has never again tried to invade Cuba is that to do so would have made Iraq look like a tea party. The Cuban people would have fought the United States invaders tooth and nail, and with their teeth if necessary, for as long as was necessary, and the United States knew that. An armed, conscientized, politicized people will never allow their land and country to be invaded and occupied, and Cuba is at the top of the league in all of those respects. But you're right to say that this deal may not hold. It may not even go through. It may stop at the events so far of the reopening of embassies in each other's countries and the flags of each other's countries flying in the capital. I hope not, but that is a distinct possibility. Let's take the gentleman at the back.
Hi, George. My name is Abdi Fatah. I'm a student and I'm the Vice President of Middlesex Global South Solidarity Society. I want to respond to what Richard was saying earlier, that the leadership in Cuba, that they need to be careful, basically not to get fooled again, like some other leaders have got in the past, and basically not let America. Okay, the deal should happen. Yeah, there's no problem with it, but they should not let America, get to them, or they might be acting too nice to them, but at the end of the day, they're still the devils, because the crimes that they committed in the continent should not be forgotten or forgiven. And also the other countries, for example, Venezuela, should continue their fight against capitalism, and that's what I was
Well, they can be forgiven, but I can assure you in Cuba they will not be forgotten. Because I know Cuba very well and I know the leadership very well, you'll have to trust me when I say that the Cuban leadership is second to none in the world, in its understanding, in its determination, in its discipline. And they know, I'm sure, Bernard goes there more often than me, he'll tell me if I'm wrong or not, they know the kind of challenges that lie ahead, and I'm sure that they are planning for them. In the case of Libya, I know you and I have disagreed on this before, but it's a very good comparator here. Gaddafi bowed the knee to the United States. He allowed them to come in, he allowed them to disarm him, he allowed them to take control of the country's sovereign wealth. They took everything that they could carry, including blowing 80% of Libya's sovereign wealth. And then they helped to destroy Gaddafi and see him lynched and murdered. And many black people in Libya afterwards, literally, also lynched. Trust me, that would never happen in Cuba. Never, ever, ever. Anyone who's not been in yet? Yes, young gentleman at the front. Yes.
Hello. You mentioned there had been many chapters in the United States' interference in many parts of the Third World, or what could be called the Third World, in the Far East, in Latin America. And the current chapter we're in right now is the bloody morass that is the Middle East, and in much of what many people would say is the Muslim world. Do you think this chapter is ever going to close, and do you think with its close will also spell the downfall of the US's global hegemon?
Well, we're in a period of great paradoxes. At the same time as mending relations with Cuba, President Obama is deliberately deteriorating relations with Venezuela. At the same time as making a deal with Iran, the United States is seeking to criminalize, marginalize, punish Russia. So these are great paradoxes. At the same time as supporting the Iranian position vis-a-vis ISIS and the Al-Qaeda presence in Iraq, the United States is supporting that very same presence in Syria. At the same time as sitting down and making a deal with the leadership of Iran on the nuclear question in Iran, they are helping Saudi Arabia to mercilessly bomb the people of Yemen in the interests of a proxy war being fought by Saudi Arabia against Iran. So we're in a swirling, twirling maelstrom of paradoxes. Now, whether the United States has a great plan that I'm not clever enough to divine, or whether they are not James Bonds but Austin Powers and actually stumbling, bumbling, tripping from one foreign policy issue after another and acting in entirely contradictory ways, which happens to be my own theory. Only time will tell. But no one should imagine that peace, if it comes between America and Cuba, will necessarily presage any peace anywhere else. Yes?
Yeah, a question for you, George, about how you see the prickly question of democracy in Cuba. And I think I should preface this question by saying, on the one hand, it's very difficult, I think, for me as a Brit, to opine about Cuban democracy, given the fact that I'm a citizen of a country where democratic structures are far from perfect and have been continually hollowed out over the last 30 years. I think that it's incredibly difficult to have a haughty, superior view to Cuba, particularly because of the blockade, which was designed to undermine Cuban democracy. And actually, if you speak to many Cuban intellectuals who are very close to the government there, they say, yes, that has had the effect of making us a less open society than we might otherwise have been, because we've been at war. Quite obvious. And thirdly, I think it's difficult to talk about the question because many of us who are in the anti-war movement more generally have seen so many times since the fall of the Soviet Union that the pretext of democracy and human rights has been used again and again and again to justify the crushing of democracy and human rights and social justice. But with all those caveats in place, do you think that the possible ending of the embargo blockade that may well happen over the next few years, do you think that that might usher in a moment where Cuban democratic structures that do exist but don't function perfectly might be deepened?
Well, in a sense, you very powerfully answered your own question. You called them caveats. I'd call them answers. In this country, when Hitler was at the Channel ports, 21 miles away, not 90, but not that much different, and our country was under siege and under threat of invasion and under conditions of war, our democracy was suspended. We had no elections between 1939 and 1945, and in parliamentary by-elections caused by the death of MPs, the main parties agreed not to stand against each other. This was a suspension of our democracy. Of course, freedom of expression and media and so on was equally suspended. If it were not, the public would have known that Parliament had been bombed and the House of Commons, where Mr. Churchill was making his famous speeches, had moved to a basement. But they never knew that because such information was tightly controlled. Of course, there were severe restrictions on economic activity for us in conditions of war and siege, with rationing and many other government controls. So Cuba has been in a comparable situation, not for 6 years, but for nearly 60. And Cuba is a small country and a poor country, being besieged and subjected to violence and effective war by a behemoth, the most powerful country in the world. So it would be impossible to imagine that Cuba could be what they call a liberal democracy in these circumstances. If we go a long period before all of this is resolved, then the political system in Cuba will undoubtedly remain as it is, by and large. If all hostility, all subversion, all attempts to effectively take control of Cuba by the United States were to end, then no doubt the deepening that you refer to would begin to occur. But here I'm going to say something controversial. If you mean democracy like they have in the United States of America, where you have two parties who are really the same party, where you have two presidential candidates who've got to raise $2 billion in order to fight each other over an inch of political life, or our own country, where the only thing certain about the outcome of democratic elections is who's going to lose, namely the working people and the poor. I don't think Cuba will have that kind of democracy, and I don't think that they should. Bernard will answer from his point of view right after this. You're watching كلمة with me, George Galloway, on Al Mayadeen. From London, but talking about Cuba. I gave, perhaps too long, an answer to a question just before the break. The expert here, Bernard Reagan, from the Cuba Solidarity Campaign, should have his answer too. Bernard.
Well, I think you're right to raise questions about the United States democracy. We could say the same about Britain, where we have a government in power that actually was elected on a minority of votes of the people. So when people talk about democracy, they ought to be scrutinising exactly what it is and what it means. The Cubans will say to you often, we are not as bad as our enemies say we are, and we're not as good as our friends think we are. And I think they would say that, yes, we do need to discuss the ways in which society is run. But I just want to pick up one point which you talked about earlier, George, quite rightly. And people asked the question, what will happen when Fidel and Raul Castro are no longer around? Because they are mortal, they are not going to be there forever. And I think one of the things that I think it's important to stress is that the Western media looks at politics in terms of personalities and in terms of leaders and not in terms of people. In Cuba, you have an incredibly rich civil society actively engaged in political discussion. When they discussed the recent changes about the economy that we talked about in the earlier part of the programme, they actually had meetings throughout the whole of the country in which people in their workplaces, people in different organisations, trade union organisations, professional associations, women's organisations and so on, participated. Literally millions of people. And when they had those discussions, they weren't ignored. They were able to put amendments in to the changes in the laws that were taking place, which were then presented to the Cuban government and were incorporated in the changes. Now, in Britain, you don't have that. When the Chancellor decides on his budget, he doesn't even discuss it with a member of his own party or the cabinet. He comes along to Parliament and announces the changes. That's not democracy. In Cuba, it's radically different from that. So I think we ought to be careful about accepting the stereotypes of what is happening in Cuba in terms of the way society is able to engage actively in the changes that are taking place and using the sort of models that we have and the way things happen here. It is different. And Cuban civil society is extremely active. The women's organization is very, very active, the trade union organization, the local committees. And in Cuba, for example, 48% of the members of parliament are women. That's higher than in Britain. It's higher than in many countries across the world. So I think we ought to treat with an element of caution the way in which we read issues of democracy being dealt with. And similarly with human rights. The United Nations says quite explicitly that human rights is not just about personal rights of free speech and things like that, but it's about economic rights and social rights. And those are equal in value to the question of personal rights. Now in Cuba, they are very much protected, as you said earlier on, in terms of the right to life, which is a fundamental right in the United Nations Charter. That's why health is extremely important. That's an example of how human rights are protected in Cuba.
Excellent. Thank you very much. The gentleman at the back, in the back row, please.
Hi, George. My name's Hussein Ali. I'm from the Middlesex University Global South Solidarity Society. I was just wanted to bring it back to the Venezuela-Cuba comparison. And for decades, Cuba was the beacon or the flag of Latin American resistance. I think it was only about 2 weeks after America started talking about discussing ending the sanctions with Cuba that they suddenly announced that they wanted to put more sanctions on Venezuela. I'm wondering, do you think that they no longer see Cuba as much of a threat and now see Venezuela as being this flag and this beacon of resistance in Latin America?
In fact, they've added Venezuela to the terrorism list, when nothing literally could be farther from the truth. The terrorism in Venezuela is being used against Venezuela by people based in the United States and with the encouragement of the United States, as was the case in the terrorism practice for decades against Cuba. No, I don't think it's because they think that Cuba is no longer a threat of a good example. They know that Cuba has inspired events in Venezuela and in many other parts of Latin America, indeed many other parts of the world. It's paradoxical what they've done vis-à-vis Cuba and Venezuela, not least because Venezuela is the largest supplier of oil to the United States. The very country they say is a terrorist country and which they are maintaining a regime of sanctions against is their principal supplier of oil, although they're becoming less dependent on it. No, I don't think it's that. I think it's the old adage that there's more than one way to skin a cat. But I have no doubt that they wish to skin both cats, Cuba as well as Venezuela. Who's next? Anyone who's not been in? We haven't heard from any of the women present. No pressure or anything. Yes, the lady at the back.
I was going to ask, since you've been saying how Cuba is a model of the type of democracy it runs, how much do you think we can begin to see that reflect in other societies, or how much we can learn from that country to kind of...
Well, every country has its particularity, and the Cuban Revolution took place in a certain historical period, which is no longer the period that we're living through now. So that, for example, in Venezuela, you have a multi-party, free elections. Most of the television stations are owned by the enemies of the Venezuelan Revolution. The filthy rich in Venezuela, though they're most often in the United States, maintain their residences in Venezuela and use their wealth to bring about political changes in Venezuela, all the things that don't happen in Cuba, because the Venezuelan Revolution either had not the inclination or the possibility of stopping these things. But undoubtedly, the Cuban Revolution is more secure than the Venezuelan Revolution, partly because of these differences. I don't think there'll ever be another Cuba as we knew it, because I think we're living in a different era. I hope that the Cubans can retain as much of what they were going into the future, because I happen to think that it's a thing of beauty, as is probably evident from what I've been saying in the course of this evening. If the Cuban people can have the kind of economy and society that China is now building, I think that would be a very good outcome. China is the most successful country in the world, with its weaknesses, with its imperfections, blemishes, scars, crimes. China has lifted more people out of poverty than any country, any system ever in all human history. And it is vaulting ahead, so much so that the big powers view it with a great deal of anxiety. And it has a mixture of public and private enterprise, with the state playing an important, in the case of China, the leading role in the economy. I think myself that that's the way that poor countries in what we call the third world should go. That's just my point of view. Yes, Richard.
Yeah, just a quick point. I sense as well that one of the differences, following on from what Hussein was saying, between Venezuela and Cuba, I'm not an expert on Cuba, but I do know that the educational program rolled out by Castro after the revolution placed a great emphasis on educating the Cuban people about their history, about the legacy of capitalism and the effects that it had. And I think that the Venezuelan revolution, you know, it's relatively new, it's still ongoing. So I think it's not so much the US is being nice, but it's more a case of, I think they know that fundamentally, Castro has even said that were they to ever deploy troops to Cuba, which is not going to happen, they simply haven't got the resources, and there's too many Cubans, as you said, that are willing to fight tooth and nail. So I think it's more a case of they know very well that Cubans are educated to a degree where everybody would resist, and therefore it's just off the agenda. Venezuela is probably more susceptible to US power than Cuba.
That's right. I mean, Bernard quoted Cuban saying, I hadn't heard before, that we're not as bad as our enemies say we are, and we're not as good as our friends think we are. That's a very good summary, I think. In the case of Venezuela, it's not nearly as left as its friends think it is, or its enemies pretend that it is. A tax on rich people in Venezuela is lower than it is on rich people in Britain. More of the economy is in the private sector in Venezuela, after all these years of the Venezuelan revolution, than, until quite recently, the British economy was. Actually, the Venezuelan revolution is more like the Labour program of 1945, implemented in a capitalist country through parliamentary democracy. The hysteria that particularly the liberal media deploys against Venezuela is just ludicrous. I mean, it's painted as if it were a Bolshevik revolution that's going on there, and that the rich are being expropriated and so on. None of which is true, Richard.
Just a really quick point.
As a representative of the liberal media.
No, I don't ever want to be considered that. I hope not. Yeah, and I think that's the other sort of question I was going to put, is when are the mainstream media at least going to eventually roll around? Because I've seen a few, I think even one with you, it might have been Channel 4, supposedly a bastion of the liberal press, ignoring the fact that if you're born in Cuba, you live longer than many other so-called developed cities, free housing, healthcare. At what point is the mainstream media going to come around to reflecting the actual democracy that is evident in Cuba, as opposed to the other points they emphasize, which they focus on and cherry pick?
Never. Not until the last editor of the Daily Mail is strangled by the last copy of his newspaper. We have a rotten, vile, and deliberately distorting media in this country. It has liberal edges, like Channel 4 News, although the interview in question that you referred to with Krishna Guru Murthy was mistakenly put up on YouTube as being an interview on Fox News. But that mistake was easily made, because he could have been representing Fox News in the interview, in the argument, about, I think it was about the move of Fidel Castro out of the leadership. I can't recall now. That's the liberal end. The Guardian is the liberal end, and the Daily Mail and the Daily Telegraph are the right-wing end. But all of them are part of a prevailing orthodoxy, and that prevailing orthodoxy is that countries like Cuba, a real material challenge to the prevailing orthodoxy, which has succeeded in very considerable part, cannot be permitted and must be defeated.
Just really quickly as well, I don't think by any stretch, and I'm not saying people are suggesting that the mainstream media, it just doesn't have the monopoly on information and power that it used to, because I think even in the case of the Venezuelan revolution, when Capriles had literally all of the media on his side, and yet the Venezuelan people came out in their masses and voted overwhelmingly for Chavez. So I think, you know, the power that the mainstream media wield is diminishing anyway.
Well, hallelujah, that's an important new factor. But I was there, and it wasn't quite overwhelming. Even with Chavez, even with all the achievements, Chavez got 57% of the vote. That's not overwhelming enough. And Maduro won his term with 51% of the vote. Nothing magical about either number, but it shows that for the United States, there's still everything to play for. And you can use the mixture of liberal media and right-wing media to further undermine and erode the revolutionary process that has occurred there. I don't, as will be evident, have any confidence that any of our so-called mainstream media will ever change. But the real change that you've identified is that people like you and people like me and people like all of us here tonight are able to make programs, are able to take photographs with our phones are able to write articles on the internet, are able to search for the truth everywhere on the internet in a way that was not possible when me and Bernard were young revolutionaries. This is a magnificent change, and it is the most important change, that the monopoly on information and communication that the ruling elites enjoyed since the beginning of time is over. And there are more informed people in Britain today than there has ever been, and more informed people in the world today than there has ever been. Cuba has been like, especially since 1990, the 300 Spartans holding the pass at Thermopylae, hoping that the city-states would rise up and change and join them. It has been an heroic, unbelievably heroic period. The special period was dark and dismal and dangerous because 80% of Cuba's trade had disappeared overnight with the collapse of the Soviet Union and by the betrayal of Cuba by Yeltsin, who inherited the Russian government at that time. According to the laws of aerodynamics, the bumblebee cannot fly. It's too heavy, its wings too short, too thin. It can't fly according to the laws of aerodynamics, but it flies, and a very beautiful sight it is too. According to the normal laws of politics and economics, Cuba should have fallen long ago, but it never fell, and its resplendent colors, I hope, will fly forever. I've been George Galloway. This has been كلمة حرة for Al Mayadeen Television. Thanks for joining us.